Good. So in the Renaissance, we start seeing this expansion into large scale works. Composers are branching out, connecting individual pieces to each other. It's the difference between a hit single and a concept album, right? Does everybody understand what I mean about small scale versus large scale? Good. Okay, excellent. Fantastic. I see some thumbs. So, oh wait, something in the chat. Like an EP. Yeah, exactly. So if I just have a regular, like the radio cut, then that would be maybe a small scale work. But if I have an EP, now I'm branching out, I'm adding sections, I'm adding variety. So yeah, the EP would be like the large scale version of that. Good comparison. Thank you, Maya. So in the Renaissance, what this means is composers starting to tackle complete mass settings all on their own, rather than individual movements. So we talked about mass pairs before. Everybody thumb through your notes. Remind me which two movements of the mass originally got paired. What would be paired with each other at first?
Would it
Please
be
tell
the
me.
Kyrie and the Gloria?
Nine. Okay, so those are two. So we've got, well, okay, I'll just say this. So we've got the Gloria and the Credo, and then the Sanctus and the Kyrie. So those two pairs exist. So yeah, we can say the Kyrie and the Credo are sets of pairs. Does that make sense? Good, good, good. Okay, please tell me you guys are taking notes. I'm not talking into the void, right? Okay. All of the gray, good. I see a thumb in one of the gray rectangles. Oh, good. Okay. So two of the gray rectangles. Yes. Three. Okay. So the bottom line is we start out, or they in the Renaissance started out by pairing movements. You would have two mass movements set by the same composer. Eventually, that leads to composers tackling all 5 movements of the Mass Ordinary. Now, we definitely should know this one at this point in the semester. What are my 5 movements of the Mass Ordinary? Okay, for the sake of time, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. Write them down now because you should know them by now. Reminder that Machaut was the first composer we have a complete cycle by. So Machaut was the first one to actually go down in the books, literally in the books, as having written a complete cycle by himself. And that was the Messa di Nostra Dame. We talked about that. Hopefully that's in your notes as well. So in the Renaissance, one way that composers start to unify cycles of masses is by basing them all on one, each movement, all of the 5 movements are based on one single pre-existing chant in the tenor. And that pre-existing chant would then be labeled the cantus firmus. Cantus firmus literally means fixed song. In other words, fixed in terms of it ain't going anywhere. It's set right here in the tenor voice, and it will be there throughout all 5 movements. So that is the cantus firmus, and the composer puts that in the tenor, always the tenor. If I ask you to look for a cantus firmus voice in a mass cycle, you should look at the tenor line. So cantus firmus, tenor, and then the composer would build the other voices around it. So you're basically, well, they in the Renaissance are basically just layering voices over this pre-existing chant. Now that sounds kind of like what we did with the clausulae and then the motets, right? This idea that here's a pre-existing melody, and we're just going to layer stuff above it. Can we all see how that's related? The idea of something that already exists and we're building around it. Good, fantastic. So in the case of the Cantus Firmus Mass, we basically have the option of branching out from those original Frankish liturgical chants. Now I can bring in, say, pop songs. I can bring in chansons, and we're going to talk about chanson masses in just a minute specifically, but I can bring in any melody that I want now and call it the Cantus Firmus. And listeners, the point would be for listeners to recognize that Cantus Firmus, hear the tune, and then that gives added meaning to the mass music. It's kind of like sampling with hip hop. If I'm a DJ today and I want to create my own mix, then I'm going to sample songs that have meaning. And when I put those songs together, I take a sample from song A, a sample from song B, and I mash them up. Then that gives new meaning to the mix that I've created. So basically what's going on is we're taking a song that everybody knows, we're putting it in the tenor, and that gives added meaning to the listener. Can everyone see how that expands on the liturgy that was already there? Now, one's fantastic. So once we have this idea of the Cantus Firmus and outside music brought in to the liturgy, composers start changing up where we put it. So not only do I have Cantus Firmus masses where that pre-existing phrase is in the tenor. Oh, by the way, here are two prime examples of Cantus Firmus masses. So Dufay and Josquin both have masses based on this antiphon and this hymn. Okay, so there's our mass on this song, this Cantus Firmus, mass on this Cantus Firmus. But not only do we have Cantus Firmus masses where we put that pre-existing tune in the tenor, composers can get creative and embellish the tune, elaborate on it. So it's not just adapting and setting the melody as it was in a pre-existing source, but sometimes the composer could add to it and make it more elaborate. When they do that, we call it a paraphrase mass. So just like if you're reading a book and you're trying to explain to somebody else what the book says, you paraphrase that author, where you take the author's ideas and put them in your own words. That's what Renaissance composers could do with source tunes. So they're taking a source melody that already existed. They didn't create the melody, but they might add a melisma to it. They might add some other passing tones. They might, something in the chat, imposters. Well, see, here's the thing. Their notions of intellectual property were very different from our notions of intellectual property. And by that, I mean, they basically had none. For people in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, once a tune was out there, it was out there for all the world to use. And in a lot of source manuscripts, we will see credit given, like, hey, this composer is the one who made this thing. But once that composer put it out there, it was free for everybody to adapt and put in their own music at will. And in fact, it was kind of an homage, because if I, as a young composer, want to create something amazing, well, then, of course, I'm going to look to a composer whom I believe is amazing. So to set somebody else's work like that would be kind of an homage. Of course, the other option is to set like traditional music that doesn't have a composer. So for example, if I'm setting a folk tune, that's the essence of folk music, is that these songs just kind of exist in the ether and we don't have a composer written down. So that's an option too. But it was also an option that if I want to honor a composer, I can paraphrase their song. Does that make sense to everybody? Did I get thumbs or hands? Because this is kind of a good. I see a lot of thumbs. Because this is a big and different concept for us because it's so different from the way we think about ownership today. So a paraphrase mass is like a cantus firmus mass in that we're taking a pre-existing song and putting it into our polyphony. But a paraphrase mass is different because we're not just wholesale copy pasting the melody into our polyphony. We are elaborating on it. We're adding things to it. We're embellishing it. The other way that, the other way that Renaissance composers could get creative with pre-existing music is a thing called the parody mass. Now, I want to emphasize a parody mass is not cutting satire. They were not humorous at all. It's not a bit of comedy. It's not parody the way we think about it today. Rather, what a parody mass is that instead of taking one melody, now composers use polyphonic music as the source. So they're not just incorporating one line of melody, they're incorporating multiple voices. They're incorporating the cantus, the tenor, the countertenor, the bassus. They're incorporating multiple voices into their mass cycle. And so rather than taking the one melody, now composers have this whole polyphonic source. Does everybody, and this is big, does everybody understand the difference between cantus firmus, paraphrase, and parody masses? Can I get hands or thumbs? Excellent. And just because this difference is so huge, can I get one brave volunteer to explain it back to me?
So with the cantus firmus, it's like a pre-existing thing that's set to the tenor line, and that's the cantus firmus. And then for the paraphrase masses, they use like a well-known like folk tune or something, and then they make it more elaborate and they add embellishments and stuff. And then with parody masses, like it's not just one line from a folk tune. They like take pre-existing polyphonic music and then set that for the mass settings.
100. Thank you, Mark. Precisely. So good. So we're communicating. We feel good. These are mass cycles. So these are the ways composers of the Renaissance could build these large-scale works of all 5 movements of the Mass Ordinary. Now, I promised we were going to talk about a specific type of cyclic mass. Oh, I incorporated pictures of those cantus firmus masses. So the Missa Ave Regina Caelorum and the Missa Pange Lingua, pictures here. So here's the Ave Regina Caelorum. There's that antiphon in our tenor. Here's the polyphony around it. Same thing with the Missa Pange Lingua. So here's the Pange Lingua. Here's that hymn. Here's the polyphony around it. So it's always the tenor voice, always the tenor. Good. Okay. So a specific type of cyclic mass is the chanson mass. And here I have to cite my sources. I want to give credit to a scholar named M. Jennifer Bloxam, who has written extensively on this topic. And in fact, she's kind of the defining voice talking about chanson masses. So credit to her. Check her reading out. She's fascinating. What a chanson mass is a specific type of mass cycle where we incorporate secular chansons, secular pop songs into the mass movements, either as the cantus firmus, or it could be all layers of polyphony. So it would not only be the tenor, but it would be in all voices. I see the same chanson. Now, this was a fad that began in the Burgundian parts of France, so the Burgundy region of France. Not only do they have good wine, they have good polyphony. So they started this idea, if it's your putting these pop songs with the mass texts so that you can make some kind of larger point. And really what they're doing is riffing on this tradition of the Song of Songs and reading the Blessed Virgin into the role of the beloved in that poem. Is anybody familiar with what the Song of Songs is? What is that text?
It's in the Bible, and it's like halfway through, and it's like basically like a love story. And it's very much like romantically driven. Just about man and wife, I guess.
Exactly. So it's this poem, and it's a love poem in not only the Christian Bible, it's in the Hebrew Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, because it was supposedly written by King Solomon, son of King David, right? That guy. So it's this love poem supposedly by King Solomon, and it's supposed to be like husband and wife as they are united. And in Hebrew poetry, it's a very like earthly revered source about, you know, romantic love. And in the Christian tradition, that got adopted to this idea of the Blessed like a kind of a dialogue between God and the Blessed Virgin. This idea that and I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of medieval theology or Renaissance theology, because the theology isn't so much the point here. It's how we use the song. But this idea of taking earthly love and using it to make divine love more relatable. So it's a strategy to help us humans understand love of something superhuman. Okay, so that's the idea behind these chanson masses. And this is not just something that happened in music. This is part of a larger tradition in visual art. So we see in even visual art, this idea of a king and queen representing the love between God and the church, right? So we see a larger trope in visual art, poetry, literature, all of that contemporary stuff going on riffs on this same idea. And what they're getting at, what these composers are getting at, is what we call an experiential understanding of love. In other words, I grow in love of God by appealing to the worldly love that I already feel. We as humans all know what love feels like on some level, whether that is romantic love or friendship or, you know, love of your family, whatever. We all as humans have experienced love. So what these composers are doing by incorporating secular love songs into the Mass is trying to help listeners experience love of the divine through relation to the love that they already feel as part of their everyday life. Does everybody understand the strategy behind chanson masses? Good, good. I see some thumbs. Fantastic. So that's what's going on here. And what's cool is that these meanings can get incredibly complex, that they have multiple layers. And if you pick apart any chanson mass, you will find not just one hidden meaning, but multiple hidden meanings. In fact, Bloxham calls them a matrix of meaning. And we can relate this idea back to the motets. Like we talked about how whenever I pick the tenor for the motet and the text that I said above it, those two texts should relate in some way to give me layered meaning. So composers and listeners could tie together associations based on any attribute, any holy attribute, and any worldly attribute that they wanted. So for instance, like the association of nature and springtime reviving, along with Easter time and the idea of resurrection. So the world, nature is coming back to life, and we talk about the resurrection. This idea of associating worldly stuff with otherworldly stuff. And listeners could hear these chansons primarily at the beginning and end of each mass movement. That's because the polyphony would be least dense at the beginning and end. So the texture is sparse, the texture is thin. I'm just hearing that chanson melody. I'm just hearing the musical quotation. So at the beginning and end of each movement, it's kind of like a giant reminder about here's the meaning, here's the frame, the lens through which the composer wants us to look. Now, popular sources were, for instance, this set of masses called caput masses. And we call it caput because that's the text beneath the original melisma that we are riffing on. So caput masses are riffing on an anonymous English chanson. There's a whole set, and we're going to talk about this more very, very shortly, a whole big corpus of work on the chanson L'Homme Armé, the armed man. There are many, many adaptations of L'Homme Armé as mass cycles. And we'll talk about the theological meanings of the armed man, but we're going to focus on Brunoise setting today. Also, it could be a form of self-promotion and self-borrowing. If I'm a composer and I want my chanson to enter the history books, if you will, or I'm a composer and I just don't feel like writing a new tenor today, guess what I can do? I can use my chanson as the tenor of a chanson mass. And that's what Guillaume Dufay did with his Missa C'est la fa sa pal. So C'est la fa sa pal is a chanson secular love song, and Dufay builds a whole mass on his own secular love song. So that's why these chanson masses are valuable to composers as well as valuable to listeners. Anybody have any questions on these mass cycles so far? Okay, so let's move on. Get my other PowerPoint for the day up. And we're going to start off talking about why L'Homme Armé was so important as soon as I can find the share button. Ah, here we go. Okay. Why was the armed man incorporated into so many masses? Because we can point to at least 40 masses between 1450 all the way through the late 17th century, so the late 1600s. That's a 200-year, sorry, I don't math well, 200-year period where composers are relying on the armed man as the basis, the source of meaning in their masses. Now, most of these masses are Franco-Flemish and German and Italian composers, and some Spanish composers also used it. So it's all over Europe. There are no boundaries on this thing. This is not one national tradition. This is a universal source. So the Missa L'Homme Armé relies on this idea of feudal society. Remember that in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, titled nobles were part of a hierarchy of vassals who owed loyalty to everyone above them. So if I'm a knight, then I owe loyalty to a whole series of nobles above me, each ranking higher than the last. And loyalty in the Middle Ages and Renaissance is code for military service. If you were rich and powerful enough to have a title, then that means you better have a horse and armor and weapons and your own vassals to serve you. If you were titled, you were military. If you were titled, you could be called up for service at a moment's notice because you owed loyalty and military service to that hierarchy. So basically, what we should read into L'Homme Armé is this idea of of a noble warrior. We'll talk more about how that gets incorporated into the music, but this idea of the noble warrior can take several specific forms. So for example, the founding of the Order of the Golden Fleece, that's a special order of knights that still exists, by the way. There are still knights of the Order of the Golden Fleece, knights and dames. Also, the 100 Years' War is being fought right about now. Also, the idea of Longinus. Longinus was the Roman soldier in the Bible who pierced the side of Jesus on the cross as he was hanging on the cross, and Longinus was the one who pierced his side and supposedly was converted immediately. So this association of the armed man being Longinus. Also, Jesus himself as the armed man. We'll talk about that in a second. But noble warrior gets embodied in all of these ways. Noble warrior in a feudal system means all of these things to Renaissance composers and listeners. So why? Well, it's not so much why, but how does this matrix of meanings get used? Well, here's the source tune. And you can see the melody here. It's this like very energetic first leap, and then it kind of falls back on you. Here's the text of it. Can somebody read the English text for me? Because I'm sick of hearing my own voice. I'm sure you are too. Can some brave soul just read that little poem for us?
The armed man should be feared. Everywhere it has been proclaimed that each man shall arm himself with the coat of iron mail. The armed man should be feared.
Beautiful. Thank you, Perla. Exactly. So we start out with a phrase, we end with the exact same phrase. And in the middle, we're talking all about this power of the noble warrior, all about his might, all about don't mess with him. So here's our melody, here's our source melody, and there's our source text. Now, that source melody and that source text get incorporated into at least 40 masses because of the layered meanings of the noble warrior. All of those meanings that we just talked about, the Order of the Golden Fleece, the 100 Years' War, Longinus, and Jesus himself, all of that being unconquerable, invincible might, power. So how do we do this? How do we incorporate this? Well, in the Renaissance, the number one way to incorporate a source text is this idea of what we call pervading imitation. Pervading imitation is the defining feature of Renaissance counterpoint. So if the English countenance, tertial harmony, thirds, three, sorry, again, I don't count so well. Thirds, if thirds are the defining feature of Renaissance harmony, pervading imitation is the defining feature of Renaissance counterpoint. So again, we're still not writing chords, and we can't analyze this as functional harmony, but we can look at these voices stacked on each other. And what we see is imitation. When one voice repeats the melodic motif that another voice has already stated. Usually it gets repeated at a different pitch, but it doesn't have to. Sometimes it can be just right on the exact same notes. Now, this idea of imitation in general had been in use since the Notre Dame school of polyphony and the earliest motets that we listened to. We've heard imitation in Viderunt Omnes. But in the Renaissance, so like the mid 15th century, it came to be the feature, the defining feature of complex polyphony. And the generation of Josquin des Prez standardized it as the go-to compositional technique. In other words, the whole way I structure my large-scale mass cycle is by taking a melodic motive and repeating it throughout voices. Today, like for us, it actually kind of gets monotonous because like, okay, I've heard the same motif like 5 times already. I get it. But that was the the basis of Renaissance polyphony. And that's why we call it pervading imitation. So through imitation, we can take this to the extreme and call it through imitation. That's when a piece consists entirely of one motif after another that is then repeated in turn throughout all the voices. It's like voices are just echoing, or the motifs are just echoing off the walls back at you. So one singer sings a motif, and then we spend the next few minutes passing around that motif. When a large scale piece exists, just motif after motif, that is through imitation. So through imitation is pervading imitation taken to its fullest extent, the extreme, the maximum possible. That is through imitation. Another way that we can incorporate imitation into our polyphonic texture is through paired imitation. That's when pairs of voices imitate each other. So like the cantus sings a motif and the altus repeats it. Then the tenor sings a different motif and the bassus repeats the tenor. So it doesn't have to be that combination, but the principle of two voices are each repeating each other. So I'm using imitation in pairs. And those pairs usually do consist of voices that are next to each other in the texture. So usually the cantus and altus, usually the tenor and bassus. Doesn't have to be, but that's usually the case. Does everybody understand the difference between through imitation and paired imitation? Yay or nay? Thumbs or hands? Good. 2 people, 3 people understand. Good. Okay. Good. Okay. So that's the difference between paired imitation and through imitation. Now, let's talk about how Antoine Benoit, he's the exemplar that I promised you. Let's talk about how Antoine Benoit incorporates Missa L'Homme into his mass cycle using all of these imitative techniques. So I want you to get the original melody in your head first. So I'm going to put this in slideshow mode for just a second. Come on, cooperate with me. Okay, so here's the actual L'Homme melody. You can see it on the screen there. Yo, wake up. There we go. That's the whole thing. That is the whole chanson. Does anybody want it one more time around to get it in your ears? Can I get a thumb if you want it? Oh, wait, something in the chat. Yes. Okay. Here we go. Andres, one more time around. Good. Okay. Maya too. Good. Here we go. Replay. Fantastic. Kind of a bop, yeah. Tenor power, yes, absolutely. Kind of a bop. I like it. So let me exit slideshow mode so we can actually see each other again. Oops. Oh, now you're going to cooperate. Great. There we go. Okay. So, like I said, this is a cyclic mass. This is a chanson mass based on the tune we just heard. What I want you to think about as we're listening to some of these excerpts is, where do we hear this chanson in the texture throughout? Do we hear it getting passed around? What parts? You have the score in front of you. What parts do we hear getting repeated? What parts is Benoit emphasizing? All of that fun stuff. So the source tune itself, the chanson La Marmite, this should all be italicized. Why are you being finicky? This source tune is in ABA form. Notice I've got my original phrase, that dum dun 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 dun. That phrase, that's the first and last phrase of the chanson, right? And then I have something different happening in the middle here. So that makes it ABA form. Now, here's the thing about the mass movements. Most of those mass movements have 3 sections. Like we said when we were talking about mensural notation, clerics preferred 3s for religious reasons that we won't go into here, but you should know that 3 is an important number. So the 3 sections of Le Marmite may or may not line up with the 3 sections of the mass movements. So the Sanctus is a movement that has 3 sections to it. The Agnus Dei is a movement that has 3 sections to it. If we're looking at the score, we kind of want to ask ourselves, is Benoit making the 3 sections of Le Marmite line up with the 3 sections of the mass movement? If so, how? If not, how? Okay. And Antoine Benoit was working at let's talk about why he's using this here. He's working at the court of Burgundy. Remember, like I said, Bloxam points out the chanson mass was a thing that grew out of the Burgundian court. So what we think is going on here is that Benoit is trying to amp up people for a crusade to Constantinople, not Istanbul, but that's nobody's business but the Turks. So the crusade never happened. It never actually materialized. But at the time, secular and religious leaders both were trying to get noble people to support monetarily and through their own military service a crusade to Constantinople. So yeah, military might, power, I want to be the armed man, all of that stuff. That's what's going on here. What does Benoit do with the Le Marmite melody to make it meaningful? What associations is he making for us here? Well, first of all, like I said in that first slide, one of the biggest associations with Le Marmite is Jesus himself. And we look at this episode in the Christian tradition called The Harrowing of Hell. Does anybody happen to know what I mean when I say that offhand? Okay, so what the harrowing of hell is according to the Christian religion, after Jesus was crucified, the 3 days between when he was crucified and when he rose were the time when Jesus is going through hell, fighting Satan, and he's leading all of these innocent souls out of hell. He's bringing all of these innocent souls out of hell into heaven to be in heaven for good, for all eternity. And he has to do that by fighting off Satan. So that's called the harrowing of hell. Can we see why the armed man would be associated with Jesus in this episode? The armed man is going to free people. Good. Okay. So I'm like waving an imaginary sword. Sorry, I need props for my next lecture. So that's the harrowing of hell. And that's what Benoit is drawing on in using Le Marmite as his cantus firmus here. What is really cool to us in the 21st century is we today tend to value what we call organicism organic unity. Does anybody know what I mean when I say organicism? Okay, good. I like the interaction and the honesty there. Thank you, Andres. So what I mean when I say organicism is that we like it when all of the pieces of a large scale work are related to each other. For instance, I like it when my Beethoven symphonies all rely on the same dun dun dun, or my all the movements of a Beethoven symphony rely on the same dun 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 motive. I like it when different arias of an opera are related to each other. So when I look at my Wagner and I see that Wotan's spear motive is being incorporated into multiple critical scenes, I like that unity, that organicism. What we mean, look, the word organ is in there, right? So just like all of the organs in your body are pieces of a whole that work together, in that same way, organicism means that all of the movements of a large scale piece of music relate to each other and symbiotically function with each other. This is a big concept for us because we in the 21st century tend to value organicism above many other musical traits. So can I get a thumb if you understand what organicism means? A hand if you don't. Good. 5 people feel like, okay, excellent. I don't see any hands, so I assume that we feel good about organicism. What is great about the way Benoit incorporates L'Homme into this is he's giving the whole mass cycle organic unity. Why? Because they're all based on the same tune. We hear that tune in the head motive of every movement. The head motive is literally, it's exactly what you think it is. It's the first motive of each movement. So we hear the L'Homme Armé tune in the first motive of each movement, usually in the superius and altus voices. So in each movement, Benoit is bringing back the same musical idea. So let's listen to a little bit of the Sanctus and a little bit of the Agnus Dei. And the question that I want you to meditate on as we listen to each movement is, where do you hear that cantus firmus? Where do you hear the L'Homme Armé tune in each of the movements? So let's do the Sanctus first. Okay, good. So we have that nice little descending fourth to leave on now. Where do we hear L'Homme Armé in that? Do we want another crack at it? Can I get a thumb if you want to hear it again? Good. Okay, so let's do that again. I will say listen low, listen low. Okay. Did you guys catch it that time? Good. Okay. Where did you guys hear it? I saw Perla in the chat. It was like right there. Where's what voice had it? Exactly. Yeah, good, Jared. So it's that tenor. And notice in this performance, they just have the soloist doing it. So when you hear that one guy's voice cut through and he's belting out, like, my goodness, this guy should be on Broadway. He is belting out, dum, dum, dum. And notice how slow it goes. So when we just heard the chanson before, it was kind of like a nice steady dum 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 dum. Okay, it was like that nice little brisk chanson. Here, let's listen to how slow. Listen again for the tenor, and I want you to hear how slow he's going. So we'll start it about 20 seconds in. Here it comes. Okay, so I'm going to quit jabbing at you and pointing, but could everybody hear it that time? Okay. Are you awake out there, TV land? Many of you are. I'll take it. Okay, so now let's do the same thing in the Agnus Dei. Let's see if we can pick it out of the Agnus Dei. Okay. What was different about that time? Where did we catch it there?
I mean, it was pretty much right off the bat at the beginning.
Right off the bat, good. And then what does Benoit do with it? Do we want another crack? The bass, like, yeah, well, and not good. Good ears, Maya. And not just in the bass, too, but notice how he's paraphrasing, he's imitating that motif throughout. So it starts out right at the beginning this time. We don't have that florid stuff at the beginning like we did with the Sanctus. In the Agnus Dei, he dives right in, and then we start passing that motif around. We imitate it. Good. Any other observations about Missa non Marme here? Anything else we should point out before we go? Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk too about the other Renaissance theorists, or I should say not other, the Renaissance theorists who defined good writing in this time period. First among them is a guy named Johannes Tinctorius. He is important to know because he was the defining theorist for several centuries, just like Boethius had been, and then Guido d'Arezzo after Boethius. So Tinctorius is on a level with those guys. He is the defining music theorist for a few centuries. He was Franco-Flemish, no surprise. Remember, Franco-Flem land is the height of polyphony. And also he was a composer himself. So not only did he like study this stuff, he practiced it. He wrote a total of 12 treatises documenting all the most important contemporary composers of the time and their music, styles, techniques, all of that good stuff. He was exploring every facet of their work. And Tinctoris was known for covering even the most elementary aspects of music in great detail. We might call him pedantic, but it's very valuable because he is going from the very basic steps and making them accessible to every single human on this planet. And not only does he explain things, he composes original music to illustrate his lessons. It's almost like the modern method books that we learn out of when we're kids. So it's like, whoa, here's this interval. Now let's play a melody to practice that interval. That's what Tinctoris is doing. It's very modern in conception. He was known for being highly empirical, in contrast to another guy named Zarlino, whom we're going to talk about next time. But please note that if we're talking about Tinctoris, we are talking about somebody who values empirical observation. Why is that important musically? Because he rejected Boethius's idea of the three types of music: mundana, universalis, humana, and instrumentalis. So somebody remind me what musica mundana or universalis is? Anybody?
Isn't that like where the planets and everything in the universe is like all aligned by like numbers and ratios?
Perfect. The harmony of the spheres, those ratios that govern the cosmos. Good. So that's musica mundana or universalis. What is musica humana?
Like the music of the human body, like organs and stuff.
Exactly. So all the ratios and mathematical relationships that make my body work. Good. And musica instrumentalis is, of course, just the music that we hear. Tinctoris rejected 2 out of those 3. He said musica mundana. He said musica humana. Don't care about it. Musica instrumentalis is the only music. Tinctoris was an empirical thinker. He wanted observation. He wanted scientific proof. He was only interested in what we can see and observe. So he's radically departing from the theorists that we've talked about before. Also, one thing that I find very cool about Tinctoris, and not just me, I think a lot of historians find this cool, is Tinctoris changes the way that we think about expressivity. So in medieval times, expressing something was all about numerical relationships, symbolizing the hidden meanings in the text. Remember, think back to Dufay's Nuper Rosarum Flores, and we talked about the numerical relationships of the mensuration reflecting the dimensions of the cathedral and Solomon's temple. So in the Middle Ages, that's how we expressed something, was through numerical relationships. In the Renaissance, thanks to Tinctoris, we start to see something called mimesis. Does anybody have any idea of what mimesis is? It's a very funny sounding word for something that we're all very familiar with. Mimesis is the idea that music should try to sound like real world noises. So for example, if I'm going to represent something in music, I'm not going to use numbers to do it. I'm going to make my music sound like that thing. Think back to the caccia that we talked about, the Jacopo's Oselecto Selvaggio. And we talked about the bird song and the hunting horns and the rippling water and wind. That's mimesis. So in the Middle Ages, numerological relationships. In the Renaissance, mimesis. Does everybody understand the difference between representing something numerically and imitating it? Can I get thumbs or hands? Because these are really heady concepts. Okay, hand up if you want to talk some more about this. Okay, good. I see a lot of thumbs and no hands. So that's what Tinctorus is about. And we should know him because these concepts he's introducing and documenting define what good music is for several centuries after. What genres are being introduced during the Renaissance? Well, the cantilena. So the word cantilena had been around before the Renaissance. It was a concept for several centuries at this point. So in the Middle Ages, cantilena meant literally any monophonic song that wasn't part of the liturgy. In other words, mass, antiphon, motet, or hymn. Those types of music were all liturgical. A cantilena was any monophonic song that was not one of those. We see how that's kind of vague, right? Not a well-defined thing. By the 9th and 10th century, the cantilena came to be associated with organum, like we heard at Notre Dame. So it was this idea of now we can take non-liturgical music and have more than one voice. Okay, again, pretty vague. By 1270, so still the Middle Ages, not the Renaissance yet, 1270, cantilena meant any polyphony not based on a cantus firmus. So we see how the meaning is evolving, right? First, it's just any monophony that's not liturgical, any polyphony that's not liturgical, any polyphony that's not based on a cantus firmus. Vague, right? This is cantilena is a catch-all term. But in the 13 and 1400s, it started to mean specifically polyphonic chansons. So secular songs like rondeaus, think back to those formes fixes that emerged in late troubadour and trouvère culture. In the 14th and 15th centuries, we start applying the word cantilena to that type of song. So cantilena was usually either 3 or 4 voices based on triadic harmony. Remember, the English countenance in the Renaissance has pervaded intervallic relationships. Everything in the Renaissance is all thirds now. But what really defines the cantilena texture is not necessarily the number of voices, but the fact that the melody is in the top voice. Notice with that liturgical music we've been talking about thus far, the melody was in the tenor, right? That Lo Morbe was down in the lower voices. With cantilenas, I put the melody in the top voice and then add voices below it. Does everyone get the difference between that? I'm going to take that as a yes. So another thing that distinguishes cantilenas from other types of music is the Marian emphasis. And what we mean by Marian is that the texts are usually devoted to the Virgin Mary. So you'll see poems to her, like what we're doing is juxtaposing, much like with the Song of Songs, we are juxtaposing earthly love and love of the divine. So we're taking secular love themes and applying them to the Virgin Mary. And again, we do this because, well, not we, they in the Renaissance did this because those composers would have seen her as the primary intercessor for humans. In other words, the Virgin Mary poses this critical link between God and humanity. If humanity is too far removed from God, we are too imperfect, we are too sinful. So what we can do instead of talking to God directly is talk to the Virgin Mary. And then the Virgin Mary will talk to God for us. So we see how there's this kind of like links in a chain thing going on. So these Marian cantilenas were a way of praying to an intercessor to ask her to pray for you. And we do this by singing love songs to her. we juxtapose songs to the Virgin Mary with secular love songs. And this works in two ways. In the first way, it humanizes the Virgin Mary and makes her more relatable to us. If I can think of the Virgin Mary the same way that I think of an earthly beloved, then that helps me to relate to her better. That helps me to communicate more authentically with her and more lovingly with her. On the other hand, the other way it works is that it sanctifies your earthly loves. It purifies the way that you love people here on earth. So not only is it humanizing the Virgin Mary, it is elevating the love that I feel on a daily basis. Everybody with me on that dual function there? Okay, so these cantilenas are adopting Marian texts to work in two directions. And these are especially popular in England. And English music at the time is mainly documented in what we call the Eton Choir Book. And you'll read about that in your Cheruscan text. But what I want you to realize about that is a lot of this stuff is coming to us from a single source, which means that our perspective may be skewed, but it gives some sense of the wider practice. So that's the cantilena. That's one genre that emerges in the Renaissance. Another genre that emerges is the Bergerette. Now, there's some sense of confusion about the Bergerette because it's a term that, much like cantilena, got applied to several different types of music. It was kind of a catch-all. Originally, it was used to describe a set of poems that shared no formalistic or stylistic traits. It was just, here's a set of poems, Bergerac. Eventually, after some time, theorists started using the word Bergeret for several different types of music that had no traits. Pass some more time, fast forward again, and we start to see the word Bergeret getting applied to songs about pastoral topics. The word Bergeret literally means little shepherdess. And so there's songs about like, oh, little shepherd girl or a little shepherd boy, and these idyllic topics, these natural, oh, they're out in the fields kind of things. That's pastoral. So Bergeret is a pastoral song. Now today, let's fast forward to today, we use the word Bergeret for a very, very specific meaning. And what we use it for is a single stanza of a virelai. Remember last time we talked about ballades or balladas? I mean, sorry, not ballades, but we talked about ballatas, B-A-L-L-A-T-A, ballatas, and how that's like the single stanza of a virelai. Well, that's also what a Bergeret is. In Italian, they also call them barzellettas, but it means the same thing. It's basically the single stanza of a virelai. Can somebody remind me what the virelai form is? One of our forms speaks, so we've had it around for a while. Okay, well, we've got 6 minutes left. So a virelai is A-B-B-A. I need, please, guys, please know that. Because when the midterm and the final roll around, you're going to want to know that. Hint, hint. Telling you right now, you're going to want to know the form speaks for your midterm and finals. So virelai, A-B-B-A. Bergeret, single stanza of a virelai. So let's look at this particular Bergeret for today. Akagim's Mabushavut. Literally, my mouth laughs. So we can already tell it's a very lighthearted topic just from the title alone. In contrast to L'Homme Armé, we're not talking about might and power and whatever here. We're talking about shepherd girl, oh, my mouth laughs, blah, 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 so pleasant, so happy. So this is a pastoral song. What makes it very representative of the Renaissance is its imitation. We see imitation constantly in Mabou Sharit, specifically through the cantus and tenor voices. So we said imitation usually occurs between voices that are next to each other. And the cantus and tenor imitate each other, usually at the space of an octave and at the time interval of 2 measures. So an octave apart and 2 measures distance, okay? So that imitation occurs between the cantus and tenor. Now, here's the heady concept that I need you guys to learn from this Bergerac. The difference between structural and pervasive imitation. We already talked about what pervasive imitation is. Structural imitation takes place in a much grander scale. So if pervasive imitation was that idea of the motif being passed around constantly, structural imitation means that one voice has a large, it's not just a motif, it's a whole melody. Now, we're not just dealing with little building blocks, we're dealing with the whole wall. So a whole wall of melody. And that melody then gets repeated by a different voice. And that interplay between the 2 voices governs the structure of the Bergerac. So with pervasive imitation, we're looking at little chunks that get passed around. With structural imitation, we're talking about a whole melody that gets repeated, and then that structure defines the piece. Can I get thumbs if you understand the difference between pervasive and structural? Hands if you want me to go into a little more detail. Okay, I see 4 thumbs and we have 3 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and let's listen. Also, one thing that is a defining feature of Mabou Sharit is the Phrygian cadences. In other words, those cadences by half steps. So that gives it kind of an antiquated, idyllic, pastoral feel. So let's listen to a little bit. And what I want you to meditate on as we're listening is, how does this feel pastoral to you? What we're dealing with a pastoral text. What signs, what sonic markers of the pastoral life do you hear? Okay, so there we go. We got through our A and our B. Good. How does that feel pastoral to you guys? I know a few of you have already dipped out, whatever, I don't care.
I mean, mostly the instrumentation, like, it's just kind of chill.
Yeah. Now, let's keep in mind too, that in terms of instrumentation, this is one of those things that the performers get to choose, right? Because if I look at the score, it doesn't tell me what instruments should be playing what or who should be singing what. Guys, please, it's still only 11:44. Please hang out just for a minute. So yeah, so that's still part of the performer's discretion. But absolutely, that very simple lute accompaniment is very effective. Good. Anything else we want to pay attention to? Okay, it is a quarter till. You know what? I see because we had very low attendance today, and I see people are dipping out early. For those of you who've stuck it out until 10:45, I'm gonna go ahead and add 5 bonus points to your quiz. So if you could type your name in the chat right now, that way I have a record of who is here at 10:45. I'm gonna go ahead and put those 5 extra points on your listening quiz for sticking around to the end of class. And we'll make it happen. So we'll pick up with printed music next time. So technology, yay. And any questions before we head out for today? Okay, then y'all are free. Thank you for sticking around. If you make sure your name's in the chat before you go, and I'll add some bonus points. Okay, thank you.